The silence in that crumbling cottage was more deafening than any battlefield I'd ever known. I stood there in the doorway, rain dripping from my coat onto the worn stone floor, watching her back as she continued painting as if I didn't exist at all. 3 days I'd been trying to get her attention. 3 days of complete, stubborn silence. My name is Garrett Ashworth, and at 28, I'd seen enough of the world to know when someone was deliberately ignoring me. I'd fought in campaigns where men screamed orders through cannon fire, negotiated with hostile village elders who spoke in whispers, but nothing had prepared me for this particular challenge. The illegitimate daughter of Count Pemberton sat at her easel, her brush moving in careful strokes across the canvas, painting the misty hills visible through her small window, as if I were nothing more than a ghost haunting her doorway. The October rain had been falling steadily since dawn, turning the dirt path to her cottage into a muddy stream. I'd ridden hard for 2 days to reach this remote corner of Yorkshire, following the directions Count Pemberton had grudgingly provided. Find his daughter, he'd said. Bring her back to face what she'd done. The way he'd spoken about her, I'd expected to find some wild, defiant creature. Instead, I found Lydia Pemberton, 22 years old and more beautiful than any woman had a right to be, treating me like I was invisible. She wore a simple blue wool dress, faded but clean, her dark hair pinned back loosely with several rebellious strands framing her face. Her hands moved with practiced grace across the canvas, mixing colors I couldn't even name. The cottage around her was sparse but tidy, with herbs drying from the rafters and a small fire crackling in the stone hearth. Everything spoke of a woman making the best of exile, creating beauty in isolation. I clear my throat again. Still nothing. Not even a twitch of acknowledgement. The elderly woman who served as her caretaker, Mrs. Bramble, had warned me when I'd first arrived. She'd stood in the doorway like a fortress, her gray hair severely pulled back, her weathered hands gripping a wooden spoon like a weapon. She won't speak to strangers, she'd told me, her voice sharp with protection. Hasn't in near 2 years now. Whatever business you have with Miss Lydia, you'd best state it quick and be on your way. But I couldn't be on my way. Not without her. The Count's instructions had been clear, even if his reasons remained murky. His daughter had apparently done something that required her immediate return to his estate. What that something was, he wouldn't say, but the haunted look in his eyes suggested it went deeper than simple family discord. Men don't send armed messengers after their children for trivial matters. I stepped fully into the cottage, my boots squelching slightly on the damp stone. The sound finally made her pause, her brush hovering over the canvas for just a moment before she continued her work. Progress, I supposed. Miss Pemberton, I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm. I know you can hear me. I'm here on behalf of your father, Count Pemberton. He's asked me to escort you back to Pemberton Hall. Her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. The brush strokes became more deliberate, more controlled. Whatever emotions my words stirred, she was fighting hard to contain them. I moved closer, careful not to crowd her, and caught a glimpse of her painting. The landscape was extraordinary, capturing not just the rolling hills and gray sky outside, but something deeper. Loneliness, perhaps, or longing. The kind of skill that comes from years of practice and genuine talent. That's beautiful work, I said honestly. You've captured the light in the clouds perfectly. This time she did react. Her hand stilled completely, and I saw her profile as she turned slightly toward the window. Her features were delicate but strong, with a stubborn set to her jaw that explained a great deal about the past 3 days. There was pain there too, carefully hidden, but visible to someone who'd learned to read people's faces in wartime. Mrs. Bramble appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming bowl. She took in the scene with sharp eyes, noting how I'd moved closer to her charge, and her expression grew even more protective. Still bothering the girl, "Are you?" she said, setting the bowl down on the small wooden table with more force than necessary. "I told you, she won't speak to the likes of you. Military men remind her of things best left alone." That explained something at least. I kept my bearing automatically straight, my movements precise. Old habits from years of service. If she associated soldiers with whatever trauma had silenced her, my very presence was working against me. I consciously relaxed my stance, letting my shoulders drop, softening my voice further. I'm not here as a soldier, Miss Pemberton. I'm here as someone who understands what it's like to want to disappear from the world. The admission surprised even me. I meant to be diplomatic, professional. Instead, something about her silent suffering had pulled honesty from me like drawing poison from a wound. She set down her brush and turned to face me fully for the first time. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with hints of blue, and they studied me with an intelligence that was almost unnerving. She was evaluating me, trying to determine if I was a threat or simply another obligation to be endured. I was at Culloden, I continued, though I'd had no intention of sharing that particular piece of my history. Saw things there that still visit me in dreams. Sometimes silence feels like the only safe response to a world that's shown you its worst face. Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, exactly, but perhaps the first crack in her defensive wall. She glanced at Mrs. Bramble, who was watching our exchange with growing concern, then back at me. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but then she pressed them together firmly and turned back to her painting. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the small windows and creating a cocoon of sound around the cottage. It felt like we were the only 3 people in the world, suspended in this moment of careful negotiation. I found myself studying the curve of her neck as she bent over her work, the way the firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was here on a job, nothing more. Retrieve the Count's daughter, deliver her safely to Pemberton Hall, collect my payment, and move on to the next assignment. I'd done similar work dozens of times, escorting reluctant relatives, retrieving runaway heirs, managing family crises with discretion and efficiency. But none of those other assignments had involved a woman who painted her loneliness into landscapes, who carried her pain with such quiet dignity that it made my chest ache just watching her. Mrs. Bramble cleared her throat meaningfully. Weather's getting worse, she observed. Unlikely you'll make it back to the village in before dark. Road gets treacherous in this rain. I looked out the window. She was right. The afternoon was already growing dim, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. The narrow path I'd followed to reach the cottage would be nearly impossible to navigate in darkness, especially with the way the water was running off the hills. Is there somewhere I could shelter for the night? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. There's a small stable behind the cottage, Mrs. Bramble said reluctantly. Nothing fancy, but it's dry. Used to house the previous tenant's goat. Lydia looked up sharply at this, her storm cloud eyes flashing with what might have been alarm. She shook her head almost imperceptibly at Mrs. Bramble, but the older woman's jaw was set with determination. Can't have him riding back in this weather, Mrs. Bramble said firmly. Christian charity demands we offer shelter, even as stubborn men on fool's errands. The characterization stung, mainly because it felt accurate. I was beginning to suspect that whatever Count Pemberton wanted with his daughter, dragging her back against her wasn't going to solve anything. But I'd given my word, and more than that, I was starting to understand that leaving her here in exile might not be the kindness I'd initially assumed. There were shadows in her eyes that spoke of more than simple family conflict. Whatever had driven her to this remote cottage, whatever had stolen her voice, it was eating at her like a slow poison. She needed help, even if she couldn't ask for it. The stable was indeed nothing more than a goat shelter, but it was blessedly dry. I'd settled my horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, with what hay I could find, and made myself as comfortable as possible on a pile of old sacks. The rain continued its relentless assault on the roof, but the small structure held firm against the storm. Sleep eluded me completely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lydia's face, the way her expression had changed when I'd mentioned Culloden. There had been recognition there, an understanding of what it meant to carry wounds that others couldn't see. It made me wonder what battles she'd fought, what losses had driven her to seek refuge in silence and solitude. Morning brought clearer skies, but no clearer answers. I emerged from the stable to find Mrs. Bramble hanging washing on a line stretched between 2 gnarled apple trees. She eyed me with the same wariness she'd shown the day before. But there was something else there now, a grudging acceptance perhaps. "There's porridge on the table," she said without preamble. Miss Lydia insisted. The cottage felt different in the morning light, warmer somehow, despite the chill that still clung to the October air. Lydia sat at her easel again, but this time she was working on a different canvas, something smaller and more intimate. A study of wildflowers, painted with such delicate precision that I could almost smell their fragrance. She glanced up as I entered, and for a moment our eyes met directly. The contact lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt significant, like a door opening just a crack. Then she returned to her work, but I noticed she'd positioned herself so she could see me from the corner of her eye. The porridge was simple but well-made, flavored with honey and what tasted like cinnamon. I ate slowly, partly because it was good and partly because it gave me an excuse to remain in the cottage, to study her as she worked. Her movements were economical, practiced, each brush stroke deliberate and sure. This wasn't the hobby painting of a bored noblewoman. This was the work of someone who'd found solace and purpose in art. "How long has she been painting?" I asked Mrs. Bramble, keeping my voice low. The older woman glanced at Lydia, then back at me. "Always had the gift," she said carefully, "but it became more important to her after she came here. Sometimes I think it's the only way she can speak now." I studied the paintings I could see around the cottage. There were several leaning against the walls, each one capturing a different mood, a different aspect of the surrounding countryside. But they all shared a common theme, a sense of isolation that made my chest tight with sympathy. "What happened to her?" I asked, though I wasn't sure Mrs. Bramble would answer. She was quiet for so long, I thought she'd decided to ignore the question. Then she sighed, her hands stilling on the dish she'd been washing. "That's not my story to tell," she said finally. "But I'll say this much, she didn't choose this silence. It was forced on her." The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone had hurt her badly enough that she'd retreated into herself completely. The protective rage that flared in my chest was both unexpected and inappropriate. I barely knew this woman, had no claim on her well-being beyond my obligation to her father. But the thought of someone causing her pain made my hands clench in a fist. I forced myself to relax, to think like the professional I was supposed to be. If she'd been traumatized, forcing her to return to whatever situation had caused that trauma would be cruel at best, dangerous at worst. But Count Pemberton had been insistent, almost desperate. He'd paid me well enough to suggest this wasn't simply family stubbornness. I spent the rest of the morning making myself useful around the cottage. There were shutters that needed repair, a loose stone in the hearth that wanted fixing, small tasks that Mrs. Bramble had been managing alone. The work gave me an excuse to stay, and more importantly, it seemed to put Lydia at ease. She continued painting while I worked, and gradually I became aware that she was watching me. Not obviously, never directly, but I could feel her attention like sunlight on my back. When I reached high to rehang a shutter, when I rolled up my sleeves to tackle the hearth repair, when I paused to wipe sweat from my forehead, she was studying me the way she studied her landscape subjects, cataloging details, trying to understand what she was seeing. The realization should have made me self-conscious, but instead it filled me with an odd warmth. She might not speak to me, but she was seeing me, in some strange way that felt like progress. Around midday, Mrs. Bramble announced she needed to walk to the village for supplies. She gathered her market basket and shawl, then paused in the doorway, looking between Lydia and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'll be gone most of the afternoon," she said meaningfully. "Mind you behave yourselves." And then we were alone. The silence that followed Mrs. Bramble's departure was different from the one I'd encountered the day before. Less hostile, more expectant. Lydia continued painting, but there was a tension in her shoulders that suggested she was as aware of our solitude as I was. I finished the repair I'd been working on and stood, brushing stone dust from my hands. She was backlit by the window, and the autumn light turned her hair to burnished copper. Without the protective presence of Mrs. Bramble, she seemed smaller, more vulnerable. "May I see your work?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, brush poised over her palette. Then slowly she nodded. I approached carefully, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. The painting she was working on took my breath away. It was the view from her window, but transformed. Where the actual landscape was beautiful but melancholy, her painted version captured something else entirely. Hope, perhaps, or the memory of joy. It's extraordinary, I said, and meant it. You've made it more than it is. You've painted what it could be. She looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw tears gathering in her storm-gray eyes. One spilled over, tracking down her cheek like silver, and without thinking, I reached out to brush it away. The moment my fingers touched her face, everything changed. The careful distance we'd been maintaining collapsed like a dam giving way. She didn't pull back from my touch, but instead leaned into it slightly, her eyes closing as if my hand on her cheek was the first gentle thing she'd experienced in years. "What do they do to you?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. But she surprised me. Her lips moved, forming words so quietly I had to lean closer to hear them. When I did, what she said made my blood run cold. "They try to break me," she breathed, her voice rusty from disuse, but achingly beautiful. "And they almost succeeded." The words hung in the air between us, like a confession, like a gift. She'd spoken to me, trusted me with her voice, her pain. The weight of that trust settled around my shoulders like a mantle, and I knew in that moment that everything had changed. I wasn't just here to retrieve Count Pemberton's daughter anymore. I was here to protect her, to help her heal, to stand between her and whatever forces had tried to destroy her spirit. The job I'd been hired to do suddenly seemed like the least important thing in the world. "Tell me," I said softly, my thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Tell me what happened." She searched my face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether I could be trusted with the truth. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she took a shuddering breath and began to speak. Her story came out in fragments, like pieces of broken glass that cut even as they revealed the truth. She spoke haltingly at first, her voice barely above a whisper, but as the words began to flow, they carried years of suppressed pain and rage. It had started 2 years ago, she told me, when she'd still lived at her father's estate. Despite being illegitimate, Count Pemberton had acknowledged her, provided for her education, even allowed her a place in society. It wasn't the life of a true nobleman's daughter, but it was comfortable, respected. She'd had friends, suitors, a future that seemed bright despite the circumstances of her birth. Then Lord Blackwood had come calling. The name alone made her shudder. I felt my own jaw clench in response. Blackwood was a man I knew by reputation, though we'd never met. Wealthy, influential, and utterly without scruples. He collected beautiful things and people with the same casual cruelty that others might collect butterflies. "He wanted me," she said simply, her eyes fixed on her hands. "Not as a wife, of course. Men like him don't marry bastards, but as a companion. He offered my father a substantial sum for my hand in a false marriage, a ceremony that would bind me to him without any legal protections." My blood turned to ice. I'd heard of such arrangements, though they were rare and universally condemned by decent society. They were slavery dressed up as matrimony, a way for wealthy men to acquire women without the inconvenience of actual marriage laws. "Your father refused, surely," I said, though something in her expression told me I was wrong. She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness that sat strangely on her delicate features. "My father saw only the money and the political connections. Blackwood had promised him advancement at court, forgiveness of certain gambling debts. The welfare of his bastard daughter seemed a small price to pay." The words hit me like physical blows. Count Pemberton, the man who'd hired me to bring her back, had been willing to sell his own child to a monster. Whatever his reasons for wanting her now, they couldn't possibly be motivated by paternal concern. "But you refused," I said, needing to hear her confirm what I hoped was true. "I ran," she said quietly. "The night before the ceremony was to take place, I took what little money I had and fled. Mrs. Bramble had been my nursemaid when I was small, and she'd retired to this cottage. She took me in, helped me disappear. I could picture it so clearly it made my chest ache. A young woman, barely 20, fleeing through the darkness with nothing but the clothes on her back and her desperate need for freedom. The courage it must have taken, the terror she must have felt. Blackwood came after me, of course, she continued, her voice growing stronger now that the worst of the story was out. He found a cottage within a week. Mrs. Bramble tried to protect me, but he pushed past her like she was nothing. My hands clenched into fists again, and this time I didn't try to hide my rage. The thought of that bastard laying hands on her, threatening her, made me want to ride straight to his estate and call him out. He told me I could come willingly or he'd take me by force. Said my father had already signed the papers, that I belonged to him now, whether I liked it or not. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. When I still refused, he struck me, called me ungrateful, said he'd teach me to be properly obedient. The air in the cottage felt thick, suffocating. I wanted to say something, anything, to comfort her, but words seemed inadequate in the face of such casual cruelty. But then something unexpected happened, she said, and for the first time since she'd begun speaking, I heard a note of something other than pain in her voice. The local magistrate arrived. He'd been visiting Mrs. Bramble's neighbor about a property dispute, and he heard the commotion. I leaned forward, desperate to hear how this horror story might have taken a turn toward justice. Sir William Thornfield, she said, and I recognized the name. A man of impeccable reputation, known for his fairness and his fierce protection of the innocent. He took one look at the situation and ordered Blackwood off the property. Said that no matter what papers might have been signed, no woman could be forced into any arrangement against her will, not in his district. Relief flooded through me like cool water. At least she'd had someone to stand up for her, to protect her when her own father had failed so spectacularly. Blackwood left, but not before promising he'd be back. He said he had ways of dealing with stubborn magistrates, and that I'd only delayed the inevitable. She looked up at me then, and I saw fear flickering in her storm-gray eyes. He meant it. Every few months, he sends men to check on me, to make sure I'm still here. They never approach the cottage directly, but I see them watching from the hills. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that made me sick to my stomach. She wasn't just hiding from an unwanted suitor. She was trapped here, afraid to venture far from the cottage, knowing that Blackwood's men were always watching, waiting for their chance. Is that why you won't leave? I asked. Why you've made yourself invisible? She nodded, tears beginning to fall freely now. If I disappear completely, if no one sees me or hears from me, perhaps he'll eventually assume I'm dead and move on to easier prey. But if I show myself, if I try to reclaim any kind of life, he'll know. And next time, he might not be so easily deterred by a magistrate's threats. I understood now why she'd refused to speak to me, why she'd treated me like a threat from the moment I'd arrived. In her world, strange men meant danger, meant someone come to drag her back to the nightmare she'd escaped. Your father, I said carefully, he sent me to bring you back. Do you know why? Her face went white, all the blood draining from her cheeks. Is he working with Blackwood again? Has he found a way to complete the transaction? The terror in her voice made my decision for me. Whatever Count Pemberton's motivations, whatever he was paying me, I couldn't be part of delivering this brave, broken woman back into the hands of monsters. My honor, my conscience, my growing feelings for her all demanded the same thing. I don't know, I said honestly, but it doesn't matter. I won't take you back against your will. Whatever game your father and Blackwood are playing, you're not going to be their pawn. She stared at me as if I just promised her the moon. But your job, your payment, some things are more important than money, I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. You've been through enough. You deserve to choose your own path. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the small space of the cottage. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, but neither of us moved to light a candle. There was something sacred about this moment, this choice I was making to stand with her rather than against her. What will you do? She asked finally. I considered the question seriously. I could simply ride away, report back to Count Pemberton that I'd been unable to find her, but that would leave her trapped here, still living in fear, still hiding from a world that should have protected her. She deserved better than that. She deserved to be free. I'm going to help you build a real life, I said. Whatever that looks like, wherever that takes us. You shouldn't have to live in fear forever. Something shifted in her expression then, a crack appearing in the wall she'd built around her heart. For the first time since I'd met her, She looked at me with something that might have been hope. The sound of Mrs. Bramble returning from the village interrupted the moment, but nothing could diminish its significance. In choosing Lydia's freedom over my duty to her father, I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And looking into her eyes, seeing the gratitude and growing trust there, I knew I'd made the right choice. Mrs. Bramble's return broke the spell that had settled over the cottage, but it didn't diminish the connection that had formed between Lydia and me. If anything, the older woman seemed to sense the change immediately. Her sharp eyes moved between us, taking in Lydia's tear-stained cheeks and my protective stance beside her chair. "Well," she said simply, setting down her market basket with a satisfied thump. "About time someone listened to the girl's story." Over the next few days, I found myself settling into the rhythm of life at the cottage in ways I hadn't expected. Each morning, I woke in the small stable, tended to Duchess, and made my way to the kitchen where Mrs. Bramble would have breakfast waiting. Lydia would already be at her easel, but now she would look up when I entered, offer me a small smile that made my heart race in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She began speaking more freely, though still quietly, as if years of enforced silence couldn't be overcome in mere days. She told me about her painting, how she learned by copying the works of masters her father had allowed her to study. She spoke of her dreams before everything had gone wrong, how she'd hoped to perhaps teach art to children or illustrate books of poetry. "I used to imagine opening a small school," she said one afternoon as we walked together through the apple orchard behind the cottage. The trees were heavy with fruit, and the ground was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched softly under our feet. Nothing grand, just a place where young girls could learn to express themselves through art. I thought if I could teach them to see beauty, to create it, perhaps they'd never feel as powerless as I did. The wistfulness in her voice made my chest tight. Here was a woman who'd been through hell, who was still living in fear, and yet she dreamed of helping others. It spoke to a strength of character that made me admire her even more than I already did. "That's a beautiful dream," I said, "and there's no reason it couldn't still happen." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression skeptical. "How? I'm trapped here, Garrett. Even if Blackwood eventually loses interest, I have no money, no connections, no way to make such a dream reality. I'm a bastard with a scandal attached to my name. What respectable family would trust me with their daughters?" The defeat in her voice sparked something fierce in my chest. "You're intelligent, talented, and kind. Those are the only qualifications that matter for teaching children. As for money and connections..." I paused, struck by a sudden idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if you didn't have to worry about those things? She frowned, clearly not following my thoughts. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to suggest would change everything between us. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge to fate itself. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "Garrett, no. You can't. You don't understand what you're saying. I'm ruined goods, a scandal waiting to happen. You deserve better than..." "Stop." The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended, but her self-deprecation made me angry. Not at her, but every person who'd ever made her feel less than the extraordinary woman she was. "Don't you dare diminish yourself like that. You're the strongest, most courageous person I've ever met." "I'm a coward hiding in a cottage," she protested. "You're a survivor who refused to let evil men break her spirit," I corrected. "You ran when running was the only option. You've lived on your own terms rather than submit to being someone's possession. That's not cowardice, Lydia. That's heroism." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she wasn't pulling away from me anymore. Even if that were true, marriage shouldn't be about solving problems. It should be about love. The word hung between us, heavy with possibility and fear. I stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of blue in her gray eyes, close enough to count the freckles across her nose that the autumn sun had brought out. "Then it's fortunate that I love you," I said quietly. Her breath caught, her hand flying to her throat as if she could hold in the emotions that were threatening to overflow. "You can't. We've known each other less than a week. I've known you were extraordinary from the moment I saw you painting in this cottage," I replied. "I've watched you create beauty from pain, Show kindness to a stranger who came to disrupt your peace. Trust someone with your deepest fears. A week might not be long enough to know someone's favorite foods or their childhood memories, but it's more than long enough to recognize a kindred spirit. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching my face as if looking for signs of deception or temporary madness. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What about your life? Your work? You can't just abandon everything for a woman you barely know. I'm a soldier without a war, taking whatever jobs will pay, I said honestly. I have no family, no ties that can't be severed. My life has been about survival, about getting through each day. You make me want something more. You make me want to build something beautiful instead of just enduring. The wind picked up, sending leaves swirling around us like golden snow. In the distance, I could hear Mrs. Bramble humming as she worked in her herb garden, oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening just yards away. If we married, Lydia said slowly, as if testing the idea, I'd have legal protection. Blackwood couldn't touch me. You'd have more than legal protection, I promised. You'd have someone who'd fight for you, who'd help you build that school you dreamed of, who'd stand between you and anyone who tried to hurt you. Something in her expression shifted, hope beginning to eclipse fear. And what would you get from such an arrangement? The question might have sounded calculating coming from someone else, but from her, it was pure vulnerability. She genuinely couldn't imagine what I might gain from binding myself to her. I'd get you, I said simply. I'd get to wake up every morning knowing that the most remarkable woman I've ever met chose to build a life with me. I'd get to watch you teach children to see beauty in the world. I'd get to grow old with someone who understands that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords, but with kindness and stubborn hope. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When she opened them again, there was something new there, something that looked like courage. Ask me again, she whispered. I took her hands in mine, feeling the calluses from her painting, the slight tremor of nerves and possibility. Lydia Pemberton, will you marry me? Will you let me help you build a life where you never have to hide again? The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Garrett Ashworth, I will marry you. I kissed her then, there among the falling leaves with the October wind singing through the apple trees. It was gentle, reverent, a promise of protection and partnership rather than possession. When we broke apart, both of us were crying and laughing at the same time. But even as we held each other, even as we began to talk about the future we'd build together, a part of my mind remained alert to the dangers still lurking. Blackwood was still out there, still watching. Count Pemberton still expected his daughter's return. Our happiness was fragile, dependent on staying one step ahead of forces that wanted to use Lydia for their own purposes. I pushed those concerns aside for now. We'd face whatever came next together, but this moment belonged to us, to the choice we'd made to trust and love over fear. Our plans for a quiet wedding were shattered 3 days later when the sound of hoofbeats on the cottage path announced an unwelcome visitor. I was chopping wood behind the cottage when I heard them, multiple horses moving at speed. My soldier's instincts kicked in immediately, and I dropped the axe, moving quickly toward the front of the cottage where I could assess the threat. Through the small window, I saw him before he saw me. Count Pemberton sat astride a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 2 armed men I didn't recognize. But it was the 4th rider that made my blood run cold. Lord Blackwood himself, exactly as I'd pictured him from Lydia's description. Tall, elegantly dressed, with the kind of predatory handsomeness that made women swoon before they realized what he truly was. Inside the cottage, I could hear Mrs. Bramble's sharp voice and Lydia's frightened gasp. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. After 2 years of successfully evading this confrontation, it had finally found her. I stepped outside, positioning myself between the mounted men and the cottage door. Count Pemberton's eyes found me immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to anger to something that might have been relief. Ashworth, he said, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man who spent too much time at gaming tables and too little in physical activity. I should have known you'd be involved in this mess. When you failed to return with my daughter, I assumed you'd met with some accident on the road. No accident, my lord. I replied evenly. I found Miss Pemberton exactly where you said she'd be. Blackwood dismounted as well, his movements fluid and controlled. Up close, he was even more intimidating than I'd expected, with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail for future use. When he smiled, it was the expression of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Excellent," he said, his voice cultured and pleasant in a way that made my skin crawl. "Then we can conclude our business quickly and be on our way. Lydia has caused quite enough trouble with this childish rebellion." The cottage door opened, and Lydia stepped out, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear I could see in her eyes. "Mrs." Bramble was right behind her, clutching a rolling pin like a weapon and looking as if she'd happily use it on any man who threatened her charge. "Hello, Father," Lydia said, her voice steady but cold. "Lord Blackwood." Count Pemberton had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes not quite meeting his daughter's. "Lydia, you must understand, the situation has become complicated. Lord Blackwood has been most patient, but his patience is not infinite." "My patience ran out long ago," Blackwood said smoothly. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to overlook this unfortunate delay in exchange for immediate compliance. You'll come with me now, and we can be married by special license within the week." "I will not," Lydia said firmly. "I've told you before, I will never consent to such an arrangement." Blackwood's pleasant expression didn't change, but something shifted in his pale eyes, something that spoke of violence barely held in check. "I'm afraid consent is no longer required. Your father has signed the contracts, accepted payment for your hand. In the eyes of the law, you are already mine." "Actually, she's not." The words came out of my mouth before I consciously decided to speak them. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders like armor. This was at the point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine whether Lydia gained her freedom or lost it forever. "I beg your pardon," Count Pemberton said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's not yours," I repeated, stepping closer to Lydia's side. "She can't be, because she's already married to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the implications of my lie sank in. Because it was a lie, of course. We'd planned to marry, had spoken of it with Mrs. Bramble, but the actual ceremony hadn't taken place yet. In the eyes of the law, Lydia was still unmarried, still technically subject to her father's authority. But Blackwood didn't know that. "Impossible," he snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping. "I've had men watching this cottage for months. No priest has come here, no ceremony has taken place." I shrugged, projecting a confidence I didn't feel. "Sir William Thornfield is a magistrate. He has the authority to perform marriages, and he's been a frequent visitor here, checking on Miss Pemberton's welfare. We were married quietly 3 days ago." Lydia's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but she was quick to understand what I was doing. She moved closer to me, slipping her hand into mine in a gesture that spoke of intimacy and established partnership. "It's true," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am Mrs. Ashworth now, legally and in every way that matters." Count Pemberton's face was cycling through shades of red and purple that suggested an apoplectic fit was imminent. "This is preposterous. You can't simply marry without my consent. You're my daughter, my property. I'm 22 years old and perfectly capable of making my own decisions about marriage," Lydia shot back. "And even if I weren't, the law is clear. No woman can be forced into marriage against her will, no matter what contracts her father might have signed." Blackwood was studying us both with those cold, calculating eyes, looking for cracks in our story. "Prove it," he said finally. "Show me the marriage lines." My heart hammered against my ribs. We had no marriage lines because we weren't actually married. In moments, our deception would be exposed, and Lydia would be dragged away to a fate worse than death. But Mrs. Bramble, bless her cunning soul, chose that moment to speak up. "Marriage lines are with Sir William for safekeeping," she said tartly. "Proper precaution, given that certain unsavory individuals have been sniffing around, trying to cause trouble for the girl. But I witnessed the ceremony myself, along with young Tom from the village. Lovely it was too, though simple. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that I almost believed it myself. Blackwood's eyes narrowed further. But before he could challenge her story, the sound of another horse approaching made us all turn. Sir William Thornfield himself rode into view, as if summoned by our desperate need. He was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. His sharp eyes took in the scene immediately, and I saw understanding dawn in his expression. "Lord Blackwood," he said pleasantly, dismounting with easy grace. "Count Pemberton, I wasn't expecting to find you here. Is there some problem?" "Indeed there is," Blackwood said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "These people claim to have been married, but they cannot produce the necessary documentation." Sir William raised an eyebrow. "Can they not? How curious. I have a marriage lines right here in my saddlebag, properly signed and witnessed. I was just returning from filing copies with the church records, as required by law." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded document with an official-looking seal. My knees nearly gave out with relief. Somehow, impossibly, Sir William was playing along with our desperate gambit. Blackwood snatched the document from his hands, scanning it with the intensity of a man looking for salvation. As he read, his face grew paler and his hands began to shake with barely contained fury. "This appears to be in order," he said finally, the words seeming to choke him. "But I find the timing remarkably convenient." "Justice often is," Sir William replied mildly. "Young love has a way of finding its path, regardless of the obstacles placed before it. I was happy to help two deserving young people begin their life together." Count Pemberton was staring at his daughter as if she were a stranger. "Lydia, how did you do this?" "The money I owe Lord Blackwood, the promises I made, are not my responsibility," she said firmly. "I never agreed to be sold like livestock to pay your gambling debts. Your choices are your own to live with." The confrontation that followed was ugly, with Blackwood threatening legal action and Count Pemberton alternating between rage and desperate pleading. But the law was on our side now, or appeared to be, and Sir William's presence gave weight to our position. Eventually, with many threats and dark promises of future retribution, both men mounted their horses and rode away. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, I turned to Sir William with a gratitude I could barely express. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. What you did just now." He held up a hand, stopping my words. "What I did was marry two people who clearly love each other very much. The paperwork may have been prepared after the fact, but the commitment was genuine. I trust you'll make it official in the eyes of God as soon as possible." I looked at Lydia, seeing the same stunned relief in her eyes that I felt in my heart. We were safe, legally protected, and free to build the life we dreamed of together. "As soon as you can arrange it, Sir William," I said, "we'd be honored to have you perform this ceremony." And so, 6 months later, we stood in the small village church where Lydia had been baptized as a baby, surrounded by friends who'd come to wish us well. She wore a dress of cream silk that Mrs. Bramble had sewn with loving care, and I wore my finest coat, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Sir William spoke the ancient words that bound us together, not just in law now, but in love and faith as well. The little school we opened the following year was everything Lydia had dreamed of and more. Children came from miles around to learn art and letters from the gentle woman who could make even the shyest child feel special and talented. I found work as a land steward for Sir William's estate, honest work that let me use my organizational skills without compromising my principles. Count Pemberton never contacted us again, though we heard through village gossip that he'd fled to the continent to escape his creditors. Lord Blackwood, too, seemed to have found other interests to occupy his time. Perhaps having his prey legally snatched away had finally convinced him to seek easier targets. But the greatest victory wasn't in defeating our enemies or escaping the past. It was in the life we built together, day by day, choice by choice. Lydia never lost her gift for creating beauty, but now she shared it freely, teaching children to see the world through an artist's eyes. I learned that protecting someone you love isn't about fighting their battles for them, but about standing beside them as they find their own strength. On quiet evenings, when the last student has gone home and the cottage is filled with the golden light of sunset, I watch my wife at her easel and marvel at the journey that brought us together. She no longer paints landscapes of loneliness and exile. Now her canvases are filled with light, with hope, with the faces of children who've learned that they too can create something beautiful. Love, I've learned, isn't about rescuing someone from their circumstances. It's about choosing to build something better together, day after day, brush stroke by brush stroke, until you've created a masterpiece that neither of you could have achieved alone. And if you're watching this story from somewhere in the world, know that your own chance at such happiness is waiting for you. You just have to be brave enough to reach for it.